Let me get started with your concerns about Chinese equipment, because you had an op-ed published last week that said that letting this equipment into America's 5G networks would open the door to censorship, surveillance, espionage, and other harms. What sort of evidence have you seen that would lead you to this conclusion?
We've seen a great variety of evidence with respect to particular Chinese vendors behaving in ways that are not consistent with the rule of law, with free markets and the like. For example, earlier this year, the Department of Justice announced an indictment against Huawei, in which case the indictment specifically states that Huawei officials offered bonuses to individuals who successfully stole confidential information from certain businesses. And more generally speaking, this is part of the overall Chinese government effort, we fear, to leverage their influence over global commerce. The last month, we've seen controversies involving everything from the NBA to Taiwanese flag emojis to even esports. And that's one of the concerns we have. If the Chinese government is willing to take steps on those areas, when it comes to our 5G networks, which are going to transform our economy, it raises a risk concern that I don't think many Americans want to take.
No wonder the FCC has a vote coming up November 19 to prohibit companies receiving federal subsidies from buying equipment from Huawei and ZTE, right? Take a listen to what the Huawei security officer had to say about the implications of this vote.
The 130 companies that would like to sell to Huawei amount for probably over 40,000 U.S. jobs. We would hate to see that impact. The fact is Huawei is going to do fine. Our revenues for the first 3 quarters, year over year, were up 24%. We're going to do fine, even if we can't do substantial business in the United States.
So will this banning of firms selling to Huawei or carriers not being allowed to use cheaper Chinese equipment have an impact on these U.S. firms and jobs?
Well, I start from a bedrock principle. When it comes to the security of America's communications networks, we can't take a risk and hope for the best. We need to get it right, especially with something as transformative as 5G. And that's why when we've rolled out our proposal, we've made very clear that we don't want federal funds coming from the FCC to be spent on untrusted vendors, wherever they might be located or whoever they might be. In this particular case, we have serious concerns that China's national intelligence law requires companies like Huawei to comply with requests from intelligence services and not to disclose that to any of their customers.
To be fair, Beijing argues that 2017 national intelligence law that you're alluding to is actually defensive. It doesn't authorize preemptive spying. Why aren't you convinced?
In part because the Chinese government has made clear they want to leverage their influence in any particular area, and especially when it comes to telecom networks, that is a risk we simply cannot take. Secondly, we've seen evidence, I mentioned the indictment involving T-Mobile earlier this year, that vendor in particular has engaged in certain practices that we find problematic. And here again, we want to make sure that the equipment and services going to America's communications networks are secure. That is the base level expectation that every American regulator, every American consumer should have.
But these small and rural carriers have bought Chinese equipment because they're cheaper, right? So if you tell them that you have to remove them and replace them, what would be the financial cost for them, and would you help them out?
2 different points. The only problem with cheap is that sometimes it can cost too much, and especially when we're talking about national security, that is a risk we don't want to take. But secondly, later on this month, the FCC will be voting on my plan to evaluate what equipment from Chinese vendors is in our networks and to think about ways to fund the replacement of it. And so that's a conversation we're going to be kickstarting in a couple of weeks because we recognize the concern that has been raised.
Where would the money come from? Would that come from also the Universal Service Fund?
Congress is currently considering legislation to fund the removal and replacement of that equipment.
Would that happen before they actually go through the process? Because some of these small carriers don't actually have the credit to go ahead and do it and then get it refunded.
That's one of the things that we're going to be exploring in this conversation about how to make that transition from the current state of the network to the more trusted vendor framework that we'd like them to operate under.
The reason that we're focusing so much on security these days is because of the launch of 5G, right? Okay, so 2 companies that have said that they will try to deploy flawlessly this 5G has been T-Mobile and Sprint. You have cleared them for their merger. Do you expect the FCC order to have an impact on those bunch of states that are actually suing that they don't want to see this happen?
Well, certainly I would hope that those states would recognize what the FCC has recognized, what many people have recognized, that the consummation of this transaction would be in the public interest. One of the commitments I got from the companies and that the companies agreed to was to deploy 5G to 99% of the American population within 6 years. 50 megabit per second service or greater to 99% of Americans. That's a huge public interest benefit, more in-home fixed broadband competition, price commitment. These are the kinds of things that are going to be consistent with the public interest.
The argument, though, is that that would have happened anyways because T-Mobile and Sprint had committed to the deployment of 5G anyways.
That's not the case when you look at the spectrum assets alone. For example, T-Mobile has a very good position in low-band spectrum and high-band spectrum, but it doesn't have mid-band spectrum assets. Sprint has good mid-band spectrum assets, but not necessarily strong low or high-band assets. For 5G, you need a mix of all three, low, mid, and high. And we think that that newly capitalized company, once it's together, will be a greater competitor. And especially when you're talking about an industry where, by some estimates, the two largest competitors have 93% of the free cash flow, we want to turbocharge a third competitor to compete with them. And we believe this transaction will do that.
When would this happen? It's been 18 months. When do you expect it to happen when even that hearing by the state's lawsuit hasn't happened?
I can't forecast what litigation is going to, how the litigation is going to turn out. That, of course, depends on the state AG lawsuit here in New York. From our perspective, at least, we want to make sure that the public is able to benefit from some of these commitments we've gotten from the parties that will deliver faster, better internet access services when it comes to wireless well into the future.
You've also spoken extensively about big tech, regulating them, the freedom of speech as well, especially when it comes to companies being able to block some content that they don't want to see. What are your thoughts about Twitter now banning political ads and Facebook not doing so?
So we don't regulate content companies like that. We don't discuss the content decisions that they make. What I will say is that we've consistently said, and I personally have said, that it's important to have transparency across the entire internet economy. Tell the American consumer, tell the American government how you're making some of these decisions. And I think that will give people better insight into why you're making some of these decisions. We've seen over the last couple of years in particular, there's been a growing groundswell on both sides of the aisle in Washington of concern about how some of these powerful digital platforms are making these decisions. Increasingly, that is the public square in the digital era, but we don't know how some of those decisions are.
Do you think a blanket ban on political ads help that cause that you're talking about right now?
That's a decision that those private platforms would have to make, and I know legislators are looking at that issue. From my perspective, at least, we just want to make sure those digital platforms are available to as many Americans as possible and that they're transparent so that consumers can understand what they're getting.
So you've spoken about transparency, privacy issues, free expression in your blog post last year. What progress have you seen so far?
So far, it's been in fits and starts. I think some companies are recognizing that they need to be more transparent about how they make some of these decisions. But you see in Washington now at some of these hearings and in other fora that we still don't have a lot of insight into how some of these decisions are made. And that's, I think, something that's very important across the entire internet economy. At the FCC, for example, we have a very strong transparency rule where every network operator, no matter how big or small, no matter where they operate, has to disclose its business practices and network management practices. That's, I think, something that every American, regardless of political stripe, would agree with. There's now a very strong conversation in Washington and across the country. How should these powerful tech giants abide by those same principles? We're not sure how the conversation is going to evolve, but it's important to have one.